Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Connie Lester, and I am the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. If you are new to these podcasts, you may also want to visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook. We've added a new feature to the Facebook page and now include abstracts of each of the quarterly articles. Today's podcast features interviews with 4 authors who contributed to the fall 2011 issue of the Quarterly, which was a special issue on the 1810 West Florida Rebellion. Dr. Samuel C. Hyde, Jr., professor of history at Southeastern Louisiana University, director of the Center for Southeast Louisiana Studies, and the Leon Ford Endowed Chair in Regional Studies. Dr. William S. Belko, an associate professor of history and the author of The Invisible Duff Green, Whig of the West, and the America's 100 Years' War, U.S. Expansion to the Gulf Coast, and the Fate of the Seminoles, 1763 to 1858. Our third interviewee is Cody Scallions, who recently received his M.A. in History at Southeastern Louisiana University. The final interview is with James G. Cusick, who is curator of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History at the University of Florida and the author of The Other War of 1812, The Patriot War and the American Invasion of East Florida. Dr. Hyde served as the special issue editor and contributed the introductory article, Setting a Precedent for Regional Revolution, the West Florida Revolt Considered. Dr. Belko's article looks at the rebellion from the perspective of the James Madison Administration and the rebellion's role in the development of the no transfer policy. The title of his article is The Origins of the Monroe Doctrine Revisited, the Madison Administration, the West Florida Revolt, and the no transfer policy. Cody Scallions argues in his article The Rise and Fall of the Original Lone Star State, Infant American Imperialism Ascendant in West Florida, that the revolt produced a viable state that was then subsumed into the United States in an action that suggested American imperialism. James Cusick's article, Some Thoughts on Spanish East and West Florida as Borderlands, places the revolt within the context of current historiography of Borderland studies. The authors of this issue of the Quarterly presented their articles for discussion at a roundtable session at the October 2011 annual meeting of the Gulf South Historical Association in Pensacola, Florida. In addition to the featured articles, the fall issue includes 2 article-length tributes to Stetson Kennedy, written by Dr. Paul Ortiz, Associate Professor of History at the University of Florida and Director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and Dr. Benjamin Brotemarkle, Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society. Dr. Daniel Murphy, Associate Professor of History at the University of Central Florida and Assistant Editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly, conducted the interviews.
Can you identify yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes, my name is Samuel C. Hyde, Jr. I am Leon Ford Endowed Chair, Professor of History, and Director of the Center for Southeast Louisiana Studies at Southeastern Louisiana University, and I've been studying the West Florida Revolt since the late 1980s.
Okay, well, let's get to the questions then. The recent special issue that you guest edited for the Florida Historical Quarterly centered on the West Florida Revolt. Can you briefly summarize the event?
Yeah, the West Florida Revolt is one of the most extraordinarily dynamic yet tragically overlooked events in American history. And I say that not simply because it had such a great impact right here in our region along the Gulf Coast, but it had enormous consequences not simply for all of North America, but even in South America. It is arguably the starting point for a domino effect which led to hemispheric freedom from Spanish colonial authority. And in our area in particular right here, it involved multiple different factions, competing loyalties, overlapping land claims. What is very curious that people don't often realize that the West Florida Revolt, though it is called West Florida, it actually occurred in what is known as Louisiana-Florida parishes, specifically that area between the Mississippi River and the Pearl River. They tried to extend it further towards Mobile and Pensacola, but the Americans moved in and nipped that effort in the bud. But in that area between the Mississippi and the Pearl Rivers, that region of Louisiana was left out of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. And that immediately created some agitation among some residents of the area who wanted to be attached to the new American nation. But there were other factions there too. A second faction were the pro-Spanish loyalists. And these people were probably the majority, perhaps a significant majority in the area. And people often say, well, why is many of them are Anglo settlers, many of them had been former British loyalists who were persecuted on the East Coast after the American Revolution. So there were those two factions, the ones that wanted annexation by the United States, the other that very much did not, and then a third faction emerged. When the armed insurrection against Spanish authority occurred in September of 1810, there emerged in its wake a third faction, which we call the Independents, and they looked to the benefits of being an independent nation. This is the group that flirted with the idea of making West Florida a new nation in its own right, perhaps allied with Britain, perhaps other powers. They hoped to extend it all the way to Mobile and into Pensacola and perhaps even further. A lot of people don't realize that that's where the West Florida Revolt is, where the Lone Star flag came from, and the American stars and bars, or the red, white, and blue was raised over West Florida. A lot of people were unhappy about that, but many of them chose to instead leave the area, and they went to Texas, and there they helped foment the revolt in Texas, and of course the Lone Star flag was adopted out there, and the moniker, Lone Star State. And then, of course, later in California, there was another similar event, and in Latin America, and we like to look at it that it all started right here in West Florida.
Well, in terms of historical literature, or how historians have looked at this in the past, how do the articles in this special issue differ from past evaluations of the West Florida Revolt?
I believe that this issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly is going to offer the most dynamic, compelling, and comprehensive look at the West Florida Revolt offered anywhere. What we chose to do was not simply reanalyze events that had long been known. Instead, we looked at it from a multifaceted, layered approach, which was based on new primary source evidence that had been uncovered, and which has been uncovered since we began really intensively looking at this in 2002-2003. What's happening in the big picture, what's happening in Washington, what's happening in the border regions and other regions of Florida and the Gulf South, and the dynamics of what's happening on the ground. So this edition of the Florida Historical Quarterly, I believe, is going to be the defining piece for understanding this period, not simply of history in West Florida, but of the entire Gulf South, the South, nation, and even into Latin America.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Dr. Hyde, for speaking with us today.
Glad to do it.
Can you identify yourself for the audience and tell us a little bit about you?
My name is Dr. William S. Belko. I'm an associate professor of history, author of several articles and books, several which deal with the southern frontier, especially the Spanish Gulf borderlands. And I've also done a number of grants for the federal government dealing with the 1818 invasion of Spanish Florida by the United States with General Andrew Jackson. So the southern frontier has always been a great interest to me, including the acquisition of all of Florida.
Okay. Well, let's get started with the questions then. In your contribution to the special issue on the West Florida Revolt, you addressed the role of diplomacy. How does a diplomacy-centered evaluation help us understand the significance of the West Florida Revolt better?
A diplomacy-centered evaluation to the West Florida Revolt helps us understand that important event in several ways. First, this was much more than a local uprising taking place somewhere in the backwater of the Spanish Empire, the southern frontier. The revolt had international implications. International rivalry in that southern region consumed the attention of more than just the United States, consumed the attention, obviously, of Spain, but of Great Britain as well, and to an extent, France. Quite simply, the events unfolding in West Florida during the year 1810 affected the global community as much as the local residents involved. Secondly, The West Florida Revolt demonstrated how much national security considerations dominated not just the Madison administration, but all of the administrations of the Virginia dynasty. From President Jefferson to President Monroe, the Spanish Floridas always stood at the top of their list when it came to worrying about the security of the United States. And I mean national security in all of its implications, from eliminating the direct threat of foreign invasion, to eliminating the potential for Indian warfare or slave rebellions, to securing American commercial expansion by way of territorial acquisition. Third, and most importantly, because of the West Florida Revolt and the diplomatic maneuvering that accompanied it, the Madison administration established a precedent, an actual policy, a process, if you will, for future American territorial expansion. From all of Florida in 1819 to Texas and California in the 1840s to our interest in the Caribbean in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And as a result, this no-transfer policy that originated directly in the West Florida affair will become an integral component of the Monroe Doctrine, promulgated in 1823, and thus it becomes a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy throughout the entire 19th century and into the early 20th century.
That's interesting. I guess kind of related then, what does the Madison administration's handling of the West Florida Revolt indicate about U.S. views on territorial expansion in general?
Well, for one, obviously, territorial expansion was driven overwhelmingly by concerns over U.S. national security. In this case, security along within this very volatile region of the southern borderlands. For the Madison administration, as it was for all three of the Jeffersonian administrations, security and expansion were synonymous. Territorial acquisition had the potential of relieving the United States from some very serious security concerns, from invasion by a foreign power to Indian warfare incited by foreign powers, to the potential of slave rebellion incited by foreign intrigues, foreign powers. But national security also meant commercial security, and thus territorial expansion meant commercial expansion. The United States would acquire all the Spanish Gulf borderlands, all of Florida and into Texas. We secure not just protection from military invasion by a foreign power or Indian warfare or slave rebellion. We open all the navigable waterways to the Gulf of Mexico and beyond. We secure markets for the massive increase in agricultural production that will come from the territorial acquisition of these lands. The national security for the Madison administration also revealed an intense Anglophobia. It seemed everywhere we looked, we perceived a direct or indirect threat of British intrigues, of British involvement, British threats to the young republic. In many respects, the West Florida affair was just one event among others involving territorial expansion to expel, to eradicate once and for all, the British presence from North America. It was America's Cold War, if you will, of the late 18th century and early 19th century, with, of course, two hot wars involved. But the West Florida affair also exposed a pattern, an avowed policy on behalf of the Madison administration for acquiring territory. And that policy was, first, avoid any overt aggressive policy of unilateral direct military action, and instead rely more on the people in these foreign parts to overthrow the European overlord and voluntarily request entrance into the American Union. This removed the United States from any messy foreign entanglements, and relieved them from any blame for apparent active involvement, for any apparent complicity. It's really kind of a form of plausible denial. Then, if we need to, we will use military involvement. But on a final note, in the end, the handling of the West Florida Revolt by the Madison administration indicated a nascent manifest destiny, and really to some degree an avowed policy driven by a sense that the North American continent should and will become all American.
Well, on that note then, you mentioned pattern of acquiring territory, manifest destiny. What role, if any, did the West Florida Revolt play in the eventual U.S. acquisition of Florida as a whole?
Oh, the West Florida Revolt played a direct role, more so a pivotal role, in that the reaction to West Florida sets the stage for how to take the rest of Florida, establish a preferred pattern, if you will. Not always successful, but a preferred pattern for territorial expansion. One that tried to absolve the United States from any culpability in the affair. And secondly, the West Florida Revolt gave us the no transfer policy, which was founded in the actions and in the language of the Madison Administration and confirmed by Congress in the no transfer resolution of 1811 as a policy that will direct us for more territorial expansion in the future. It becomes part of the Monroe Doctrine, and because of that, becomes the foundation for U.S. foreign policy in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And it all starts in West Florida.
Great. This is all really fascinating. I really appreciate you talking to us today, Dr. Belko.
I enjoy it.
I'm sure our listeners are going to get a lot out of this.
Good. I'm glad they will.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. My name is Cody Scallions. I'm from the Florida parishes right here in Louisiana, from a parish of Livingston in the town of Springfield. I just finished up my master's degree at Southeastern Louisiana University. This is my first publication for the Florida Historical Quarterly.
Okay, excellent. Well, we'll start with the questions then. In your contribution to the special issue on the West Florida Revolt, you addressed the role of local politics. How does a local politics-centered evaluation help us understand the significance of the West Florida Revolt better?
Well, when we look at the West Florida Revolt, what we need to keep in mind is that the local politics had a huge impact on it. And actually, the entire movement, we could say, was almost founded on local politics. Now, whenever we do bring in the whole national aspect with Louisiana Purchase and Madison and Claiborne coming in, that is a little bit later on. Whenever we bring in at the very beginning, when we talk about the revolt getting off on its foot and starting off, it all happened on ground in the Florida parishes locally. When we look at the local politics, let's start with Philip Hickey and kind of setting up this committee. The first thing he did whenever he looked at Spanish policies and the Spanish administration in West Florida, he saw that it wasn't in the best interest for many of the local inhabitants. So what he did was he actually set up local committee, and it comprised of men throughout the Florida parishes in this small area. And it was a way for them to get together and file some grievances to Governor de Lassus, the Spanish governor at the time, to let them know that things weren't in their favor and that some administrative change needed to take place. What this means is that it was all here at home, I guess is a good way of saying it. Everything happened right here, and there was no outside hands reaching in from Washington, D.C., or even from Spain at this time. Instead, it was all happening on ground. And as we progress through the revolt itself, or the timeline of revolt, it begins with the committees, and then we see the committee gets together and actually creates a convention. Now, this convention was completely a local convention. With this convention, what makes it so amazing and unique is the significance of the convention's power, because it comprised of all the social elite and even the people that followed the social elite.
Okay, based on your response, you characterized the West Florida Revolt as a democratic movement. Were they trying to achieve democracy, or did they have different motives?
It was actually different motives, in my opinion, because at this time, the democracy was more of a secondary issue to these people. The primary issue was self-preservation. These people want to make sure that their land, that all their land claims, all their farms, everything they had was secured. That's what their number one goal was. They didn't care if they had the right to vote or if they had to go and build a road for the Spanish government or whatever. That didn't matter. What mattered to them is what kept their lives, made their lives easy. That's a good way of saying it. If the Spanish government would have changed things and would have listened to what their grievance is, they would have stayed with the Spanish government because it worked. They were profiting. They would have started profiting. Now, democracy became, this democratic ideal came in later in West Florida whenever they realized that the Spanish government wasn't working for them. And so we start seeing democracy really come up with the creation of the convention and the Constitution because they started giving people what they wanted. They started giving them the right to vote. They started giving them a uniform tax system. They started giving them a militia that could protect their land from all these hostile entities in the frontier. That's what these people were wanting. And whenever we look at the Constitution of West Florida, it set up terms. It gave people a choice. And if people have a choice, that means they're going to look at what's in their best interest. That's democracy in West Florida. It's looking out for your best interest. And then the best interest at their time was the convention and this independent faction.
Okay, that's quite a lot of information to consider. Mr. Scallions, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much, and it was a pleasure talking with y'all, and I wish the Florida Historical Quarterly many years of extended success.
Can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Yes, my name is James Cusick, and I'm the curator of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History up at the University of Florida.
Okay, let's get to the questions then. In your contribution to the special issue on the West Florida Revolt, you addressed the role of Borderlands. How does a Borderland-centered evaluation help us understand the significance of the West Florida Revolt better?
Well, in looking at Florida in general, and also looking at the years of the revolt, which was in 1810, I've always thought that the fact that there was a border, an international border, separating the Floridas from the United States was a significant factor. So to give specific examples of the West Florida revolts, we have good examples starting in the early 1800s with the Kemper family. The Kemper family were immigrants into Spanish West Florida. They came from American territory. They set themselves up in Spanish West Florida, but they didn't fare very well there. They didn't do all that well economically. They did not have a lot of influence with Spanish officials or with the families who had the ears of Spanish officials and could influence them. And fairly early on, they ran into some legal problems where they were essentially lost control of their land, or they were ousted from their land. They were very bitter about this. They attempted to challenge eviction. They stay on the land. When they eventually were forcibly evicted, they went back across the border into American territory, but then they started raiding into Spanish territory. And a lot of the initial targets that they had were people in Spanish Florida, including other settlers, who they just felt had done them wrong, basically. So there was a lot of kind of vengefulness or recriminations in these raids. That was typical. I mean, that's one example. That's the example of the Kempers in 1804, 1805. But you found the same thing further east on the Georgia-Florida border at that time and at later times. There would be feuds. There would be, feuds between families. There would be fights or about theft of property, theft of cattle, theft of horses. Slaves would run away across the borders, and then there would be the issue of whether the slaves were going to be returned or not. And in a lot of cases, Spanish officials, wouldn't return the slaves to American territory, and vice versa. That caused a lot of bitterness. And then because it was an international border, there was also the problem that any time there was trouble between Spain and the United States that might lead to conflict or the potential for warfare, well, then people on the borders became extremely worried because that was an area where there was likely to be military action. Then you throw into the mix of it the fact that you had major Indian tribes living in the southeast at that time whose territories went across these borders, and so they moved back and forth across the borders all the time. This also caused problems, particularly if there were hostilities between the Indians and some of the border area settlers. So, what I kind of argued in my article was that border areas, even at the best of times, are really difficult to control.
Based on these uprisings you've talked about in both East and West Florida, was Florida an exceptionally volatile place to live for residents during the late 18th and early 19th centuries?
Well, I don't know that you could call it exceptionally volatile. Those decades are generally in textbooks thought of as being the age of revolutions, capped off by the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. I mean, it was a violent time. There were a lot of conflicts at the time, and there was a lot of these conflicts were directed at overthrowing the old order and bringing in a new order. So, even if you were living in some fairly well-established states like New York or Pennsylvania or Virginia that had big populations, advanced economies at this time. Your lives were probably still prone to the effects of temporary violent disruptions. Again, I think the problem in Florida was that the population was small, and so the magnitude of things was greater, because even a fairly small, seemingly insignificant revolt of only 50 to 100 people could cause tremendous devastation to crops, to lives, to people's households and lands. And if you look at Florida from about 1650 up until the end of the Civil War, 1865, it's almost a 2-century span of time. It's very, very difficult to ever find 20 years in Florida that were peaceful.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today, Dr. Cusick.
Well, I'm very happy to have been able to have the chance to talk to you. I hope people enjoy the issue.
Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed, scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the Quarterly are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. Go to www.myfloridahistory.org for membership details. The Program Committee for the Florida Historical Society Annual Meeting and Symposium has issued a call for papers. The theme of the meeting is Tides of Change, Diverse Florida Communities and Their Development. Conference information and paper proposal guidelines are available at myfloridahistory.org/annual meeting. Finally, you can follow the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, and researchers can access back issues of the Quarterly on JSTOR.